All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So last week we had a lesson on paradox, and we talked about Friar Lawrence, we talked about George Milton, and we discussed the idea that paradox really was kind of like taking two things that are very different, very oppositional from each other. You could say they are opposites or contrasting, but taking two very different elements or qualities and putting them together in a way that doesn't really make sense on the surface, but ultimately there is some type of truth in that, and that was what we called paradox. So this is a short follow-up lesson to pretty much just kind of convey the idea that anytime you have that quality of paradox, right? So something is helpful, but it's also harmful. Something is creative, but it's destructive. Something is positive, but it's also negative. Anytime you have that paradoxical duality, right? Those two things together, very often you are going to have irony. Okay, so irony, and this is why it's not going to be a particularly long lesson today. This is basically review. But I wanted you to understand that those combinations of qualities that create a paradox, right? Those oppositional or very different qualities, that's often the root of irony. So we'll do a quick review. Irony, and I've given you about 10 different definitions this year of what irony is, and this is just kind of a generic one, but it works. A state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often amusing as a result. Okay? So we had three different types of irony. All right? This one, and this is dramatic irony, all right, has to do with, oops, well, let me try to move that in there. Dramatic irony is defined as when an audience watching a play understands what's going on in a situation while the characters are unaware of what is happening, right? So I think for dramatic irony, first realize the word drama is pretty much in that word, right? And so drama has to do with the theater. It has to do with comedy, the tragedy, right? The little image of the masks. So dramatic irony is what you're going to see on television, in a movie, during a play, right? I always kind of made the example of a horror movie, right? Because you have your jump scares in a horror movie where just something crazy happens and you jump out of your seat. But often you have what's called a slow burn. A slow burn is usually when suspense is building, and suspense builds when we, the audience, know something is going to happen, but the characters do not know. So here are the teenagers about to walk into the old house, but we know that inside that house is a very bad person, a monster, I don't know, right? We know it, they don't. So that's dramatic irony, okay? We've already seen several things happen in Romeo and Juliet that, kind of would be considered examples of that, right? Um, the Capulets servant inviting Romeo to that evening's party and not realizing he is a Montague. Um, does that create suspense? Yeah, it kind of does, right? It gets you kind of curious. Uh-oh, what's going to happen, right? The Montagues are going to show up at this party. And so I wouldn't call it horror movie suspense, but it certainly kind of wakes you up a little and you start to say, uh-oh, you know what? Something's going to happen here. Juliet speaking her thoughts to Romeo, but not realizing he's actually listening beneath her balcony, right? So again, we know something that the characters do not know. And that's the kind of irony we're going to see a lot in the play. And that's called dramatic irony. Um, okay. The type of irony that does not particularly exist in drama on the stage or on the movie screen, but that does exist in real life would be situational irony, right? And this has to do with actions or events that have the opposite result from what is expected, right? Or what is intended. So again, a quick review. All irony has to do with contrast. It has to do with the difference between two things, right? You can call it an incongruity. You can call it, you know, um, the reversal of expectation. But all irony has to do with contrasting or contrary things. You could call them antithetical. You could call them oxymoronic. You could call them oppositional. But they have to do with um, two extremes that are pretty much put together. So with situational irony, um, I don't know. I've given the same examples all year, right? And they're kind of a cliche. But the idea that, the firehouse burns down, or the police station gets robbed, or, there's an airline pilot with a fear of heights. These are just two things that really don't go together, and that would be situational irony. All right? And the third type of irony is verbal irony. And this basically occurs when a speaker or a character, they say one thing, but they mean another. And many people consider verbal irony to basically be sarcasm, and it certainly can work that way, right? So an extreme exaggeration could be ironic, could be verbal irony, right? Sarcasm in general, an extreme understatement, all right? So, as we read the play, the type of irony we're really going to focus on is dramatic irony. But we have an assignment that I'm going to post this week, and it's going to ask you to read an article, and that might not be dramatic irony that I'm asking you to look for. It might be a different type. So, I'm going to go ahead and include that probably today. I'll post that assignment, and what it's going to ask you to do again is just read a news article and answer a few questions where you identify the type of irony it is, explain what is ironic about it, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of come up with an original irony, something that you're finding not about that article, but about the world right now or your experiences. So there'll be a little bit of a reflective question in there too to kind of get you to think a little. Um, okay, people. So take care, and I'll be in touch.